How's it going, everyone? Laszlo Montgomery here, the China History Podcast. In this first of a four-part series that I presented way back in early 2014, in less crazier times, I wanted to introduce the life and times of Morris Two-Gun Cohen, somebody who, well, honestly, had no impact on the course of Chinese history. Despite living in historic times in China, he wasn't anyone of historical significance. What's interesting about Morris Cohen was his proximity to many of the names we do, in fact, remember, men and women whose names appear in all the history books about modern China. If you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you'll do so. You'll find hundreds of episodes covering all kinds of topics from ancient and modern Chinese history, stories behind Chinese Chengyu sayings, readings from antiquarian books written by early travelers to China, and more than a decade's worth of content about this subject that I'm so passionate about. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for checking this out. I hope you enjoy the series. How's it going, everyone? Laszlo Montgomery here, the China History Podcast. In this first episode of a three-part series, I want to introduce the life and times of Morris Two-Gun Cohen, someone who, well, honestly, had no impact on the course of Chinese history. Despite living in historic times in China, well, he wasn't anyone of historical significance. What's interesting about Morris Cohen was his proximity to many of the names we do, in fact, remember. Men and women whose names appear in all the history books about modern China. CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, ran a piece years ago called The Intermittently True Adventures of Morris Two-Gun Cohen. Paula Simons wrote the story. Morris Cohen was one of thousands and thousands of foreigners who went to China in the 1920s and got to witness that historic period in Republican China and even play a few bit parts. Up until the curtain came down on those times in 1949, Morris Abraham Cohen got to see a fair amount of history that we've only read about in books. So we're going to relive those wild and crazy times of 1920s and 30s China. The places he operated out of and where his story was written were Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shanghai, London, and Manchester. I guess you could call him a hustler, a salesman, maybe a con man. We use the term roller coaster to describe someone's life, ups and downs, scary moments. Morris Cohen, he truly had such a life. He was a family man who rarely ever spent time with his family. His way to show love was in the often extravagant gifts he gave whenever he blew into town. Morris Cohen had his ups and downs. He spent time in prisons, in a Japanese POW detention camp, residential slums. He had plenty of lonely nights in flop houses living on the Canadian prairie. When times were good, he stayed in the finest hotels wherever he traveled, living high on the hog and threw lavish dinner parties and wined and dined visiting guests and dignitaries. He wasn't somebody who was written into the history books, but he certainly had an interesting China story. We'll look at his particular bond that he had with the Chinese people. This is an unlikely soul who you'd expect to fall in love with China, the culture, and the people, but he did. During my 9-year stretch in Hong Kong, I knew guys like Morris Cohen. These were old expats who, well, no one knew what they actually did for a living, but they had been there forever and had become permanent fixtures that you always saw at some of the joints around town. Morris Cohen was one such character. Morris Cohen, if you haven't guessed it already, was a Jew. He was born in a Polish shtetl, one of the real poor ones. His family of 8 brothers and sisters, and his parents were downtrodden Eastern European Jews who were chased out of their Polish village in Radzionów, where he was born on August 3rd, 1887, year of the pig, same as me. They fled the pogroms and made their way to London. The Yatsen's family, that was his real surname, they were one of the lucky ones. Those like the Yatsens who didn't get out of Radzionów in time ended up in Treblinka and Auschwitz. He emigrated to England as a boy, lived a hard life on the streets. He eschewed study and at an early age embraced a life of lying, cheating, fighting, being a two-bit con man, and he hustled his whole life to earn as much as he could. And like so many others, he didn't know what saving for a rainy day meant. If he made $1,000, he spent 1,000. He was generous with those he loved and trusted or wanted to impress and whose acceptance he craved. His family ended up in the Whitechapel district in East London. Jack the Ripper had been operating out of that area around the same time the Cohens showed up, or maybe it was the tail end of his career. Morris's father, Joseph, knew when he arrived in England he'd better 86 that Yatsen surname, and he settled on Cohen for the new family name. When Morris was young, the Cohen family lived at 68 Umberston Street in St. George's, in the east part of London, a 10-minute walk to the Jack the Ripper Museum. Back then, this area was like the Lower East Side in New York in a way, a Jewish ghetto of sorts. And Joseph Cohen, he got into the schmata business, a classic Yiddish stock and trade. Plenty of the locals in London really looked down on these newly arriving Jews in the same way Americans in California looked at the Chinese in the 1850s and 60s. They were strange, non-conforming, stuck together, depressed working wages, and stole jobs. From an early age, Moishe Cohen wasn't destined to grow up to be a good-looking sort. When he started school in 1896, he was a stumpy kid with a big head and a mischievous look about him, a face only a mother could love. He found some success as a child boxer. They called him Fat Moishe. Nothing much to say here except fighting and knocking people's lights out were among the skills acquired by Morris Cohen growing up where he did. In 1900, just shy of his bar mitzvah, he got thrown into a reform school for 5 years. He was a constant troublemaker and wore out his welcome with everyone. He wasn't what you'd call a particularly observant Jew. He had nothing to show for himself academically. He wasn't keen to learn any particular trade. In July 1905, around the time of his 18th birthday, his father, Joseph Cohen, had to figure out something to do with his son. Back in those days, turn of the century, early 1900s, one of the options for people in England with few options was to send your young'uns to Canada or the U.S. Australia was another choice. Joseph Cohen knew somebody in Wapella, southeast Saskatchewan. Back then it was called the Northwest Territory. So off to Canada Morris Cohen went. He sailed from the port of Liverpool and arrived in Quebec without incident. And he made his way to Winnipeg and from there to Wapella, 400 kilometers west. Wapella, population 354. That was not like anything Morris Cohen was used to. The overpopulated slums of Whitechapel and the high-density living was nothing at all like living out on the plain. 18-year-old Morris began his career as a farmhand, working for a guy named Robert Nicholson. He made $150 a year plus room and board, aspiring to bump that up to $3 a day if he could find a way. Morris Cohen was a lifelong card cheat. He knew every trick in the book and how to stack the deck and mark cards and whatever else there was that allowed him to diminish his gambling risk. This was one of his defining character traits throughout his life, and he learned it all in Wapella from a ne'er-do-well who also worked the same farm. He moved on to bigger and better things, heading to the southeast, making $1 a day at a brick kiln in Verdun and Manitoba. That kind of work was backbreaking and offered little reward in terms of compensation. And Morris hung in there till 1907, and now, 20 years old, he ended up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and he found work as a carnival barker for the Greater Norris and Rose Circus. And there, Morris Cohen continued his seat-of-the-pants education in the art of the scam. The circus life isn't for everyone, and it wasn't for Morris either. He didn't last long, and when the wagon trains all pulled away from Winnipeg, Morris Cohen decided to remain. Winnipeg 1907 was awash with immigrants, and the dynamic was such that it had this tremendous boomtown atmosphere. Morris Cohn thrived in this kind of an environment, and in no time at all got himself busted and convicted for pimping for a minor, and he got sent away for 6 months in a 6 by 11 foot cell. And he survived it. Any other man in Morris Cohn's similar circumstances, after the reform school in England, the prison time, the harshness of his life up till then, might have just given up or turned to drink or drugs, but not Morris Cohn. He heard there was money to be made in Saskatoon real estate, so off he went. Land that sold for $900 in 1905 was going for $16,000 by the end of 1907. Morris got the lay of the land and proceeded to make a small killing. Here is where Morris Abraham Cohn met the man who served as the catalyst that led to this adventure he ended up having. After he pulled into town, and being the type of man that he was and all, he made his way to a gambling den operated by one of the local businessmen, a 52-year-old Cantonese named Mr. Ma Sam. One of his joints was called the Alberta Restaurant at 111 20th Street West in Saskatoon. Morris became a regular there in no time at all and earned his daily bread teaming up with Ma Sam, cheating suckers at cards. And around this time, Morris Cohn was given his Chinese name of Ma Kun. There in Saskatoon, the watershed moment of his life happened. You know how it is when something unexpected and random happens, and from that one moment in time, a whole long life experience followed. Well, this was one of those things. One day, Morris walked into the Alberta right at the moment when one of the local thugs was shaking down Ma Sam and robbing him. So Morris took in the situation, and like he used to do back in Poland when the Jew haters used to try and push him or his siblings around, he approached the tough guy, had a few words with him, and proceeded to beat the you-know-what out of that guy and threw him out the door. You see, the Chinese in Saskatoon, they were in the same boat as their buddies down in San Francisco. When the white man wanted to come down hard on them, well, if they knew it was good for them, the Chinese immigrant had to learn to just put up with it. No one was on their side, neither the local people nor the law. So when Morris Cohn came to Ma Sam's rescue on that fateful day, it had a particular resonance inside the Chinese community in Saskatoon. In the wake of this incident, the local Chinese embraced Cohn and sort of adopted him into their community after that. Ma Sam was Morris Cohn's muse, so to speak. He indoctrinated Morris on all the hell China had gone through the past 100 years and that these days were coming to an end. These were the final years of the Qing Dynasty. Ma Sam was a follower of Sun Yat-sen. He had bought into the revolution completely and passed all this information on to Morris Cohn. And Ma told him all about Sun's story and how, after 21 centuries, he was trying to transform China into a republic. In 1905, the Tongmenghui was cobbled together, and Ma Sam was a member of the local branch. Morris Cohn later recalled, quote, "I didn't quite swallow all he told me, but it stirred my imagination. I was young enough to like excitement, and his talk of soldiering and conspiracy and revolution was exciting. I'd known poverty myself and what persecution meant from things I heard my parents say, and though I'd never seen China, I could guess that the life of the underdog would be a whole lot worse than it was in the white man's world." End quote. It didn't take long before Morris Cohn became a person of interest to the police and was rounded up regularly whenever the usual suspects came under suspicion. His thieving and cheating ways got him into trouble from time to time. The local fuzz first tried to use the law to get him to leave, but when he defied them and hung around, he ended up in prison 90 minutes north of Saskatoon in a town called Prince Albert. And there, he suffered through a year of hard labor. The authorities came down on Ma Sam, too, for his gambling den, and he ended up doing some time at the same prison as Morris Cohn. When Morris was released, he went straight to Ma's joint. And this was in September 1911. Morris was doing hard time when Sun Yat-sen made his North American fundraising tour. And the following month, the Wuchang Uprising happened. Farewell, Qing Dynasty. Word got around Saskatoon and in surrounding Chinese communities about how Morris Cohn had stood up for Ma Sam and was considered a friend of the Chinese. They accorded him the honor of being welcomed as a member of the Tongmenghui, and afterwards he became a regular fixture at all the places that Chinese gathered. So Morris Cohn moved up to Calgary next and stayed a while until the local authorities tired of his antics and showed him the door. And this is what led him to the promised land, to Edmonton in Alberta. I heard the weather's good there in the fall. In Edmonton, it didn't take long for Cohn to gravitate to the Chinese areas and use his Tongmenghui membership and relationships to get past the door. These were the years just leading up to World War I, and there was a major land boom going on up in Edmonton. This is where Morris Cohn really hit it big. He was making $1,000 a week and 12.5% commission on sales. He was completely in his element dealing in the seamy underside of Edmonton land speculation. In between selling worthless land at inflated prices, he continued to grow his criminal record. Nothing serious, gambling mostly. But then something began to happen. Around Edmonton, the word started to spread that this guy, Morris Cohn, had the inside track on the Chinese, was the perfect conduit for info, or if you wanted to get word to the Chinese community, or you had a business proposition, whatever. And to a certain extent, this may have been true, but regardless of his importance to the Edmonton Chinese community, when the press followed up with him or someone stopped him on the street about something or other connected to the local Chinese, Morris would make it sound as if he was practically one of them, and he'd exaggerate his connections and his influence and insider knowledge. But all he was doing was creating the myth of the secretly influential and consummate insider amongst the Chinese, a myth he carried in his back pocket for the remainder of his days. In 1913, Morris was 26 years old and doing fantastic in Edmonton. But when the market started to show signs of slowing, his real estate company sent their star salesman to Europe to go sell Edmonton real estate out there. This was Morris Cohn's first time back in Europe since he left Liverpool in 1905, and on the continent since his family got chased out of Poland. The prodigal son returned. This was a happy and tearful family reunion. Morris was reunited with his parents, Joseph and Shindle, and with all his brothers and sisters. He was what you called a family man, but in his case, he rarely ever saw his family. He completely overwhelmed them with his success and the wealth he had amassed, showing up with gifts that no one could believe. Then he got his family out of their slum and moved them to some nicer digs. Everything went great and like we do in the decades to come. After he had showered all his relatives with gifts and recounted all the overblown details of his life on the Canadian plain, Morris Cohn would leave town and then no one would see him for a very long time. Moishe, well, he never had his own kids, so he was a particular soft touch when it came to children. He was like this dream relative that you could always count on for the most extravagant gifts. Whenever Uncle Morris came to town, it was better than Christmas, or better than Hanukkah in his case. He carried out his sales in Belgium and then headed back to Edmonton. The market that he had done so well in was starting to show signs of a bubble, and there was a whiff of something foul about to happen. Once, some Chinese even took Morris Cohn to court for misrepresenting himself in a land deal. The only reason Morris wasn't convicted was because the courts, in these kinds of cases, as a matter of course, ruled in favor of the whiter party. But trouble followed Morris Cohn wherever he went. A lot of people who knew him or knew of him sort of kept their distance. So he headed back to Edmonton and through skill and good fortune managed not to get convicted for any of the felonious activities that he engaged in on a habitual basis. When 1914 came around, the economy in Canada had pretty much hit the skids. 2 years later, in 1916, 29 years old, Morris Cohn enlisted in the Army and fought with the 218th Overseas Battalion, the Canadian Irish Guards. He was an acting sergeant, and this battalion was made up of soldiers from 14 nations. They hooked up with another group to form the 8th Battalion of the Canadian Railway Troops. En route to Europe to fight in the Great War, Morris got to stop in Blighty and visit his family again. He ended up having a good time in London and got himself a dose of the clap that messed him up but good later on. When he was transported to Belgium and got to witness for himself the whole chamber of horrors of World War I, his role in the war was building railways. Many of the 190,000 Chinese who served valiantly in the Labor Corps, who were shipped off to Europe to assist in the war effort, were also engaged in constructing railroads, and Morris naturally gravitated towards them and sympathized with their plight. If you're interested, I did an episode on the Chinese Labor Corps of World War I. That was CHP episode 207. Most of 1918, Morris Cohn spent recovering from complications from his gonorrhea. He was shipped off to a medical facility in Birmingham, where he stayed till November 1918. When he got shipped back to the continent, the war was already over. So Morris Cohn made his way back to Britain after his usual lack of discipline and lousy behavior got the best of him. He was demoted to sapper and sent to a base in Wales reserved mostly for troublemakers. By February 1919, Morris Cohn was back in Canada. Despite the failure of respectably and heroically performing his military duty, Morris talked up his time spent in Europe in such a way as to make people believe he personally defeated the Kaiser, wildly exaggerating his personal contributions. Hey, who could check these stories? And as far as building on his myth was concerned, these couple years were going to prove invaluable. And like I said, who was going to carry out any due diligence to see what actually happened? Despite his sorry conduct as a soldier, he did manage an honorable discharge on March 17th, 1919. So after Morris Cohn made his way back to Edmonton, he immediately reunited with all his Chinatown pals. He tried to get back into the real estate business, but the good times had already moved on to somewhere else. All his savings from the pre-war boom were, of course, long spent. Things weren't looking too good. He was constantly in trouble for one kind of violation or another, again, usually involving gambling. Throughout his troubles, Morris Cohn always hung out with his Chinese friends and learned more and more about what was going on back in the old country. He learned the politics and stayed active in the China National League there. He very neatly insinuated himself into their world. I'm not sure how the Chinese viewed Morris. I mean, being a white guy and all, I suppose they welcomed him and found all kinds of uses in having him around. I mean, let's face it, back in those days, not many Westerners were trying to cozy up to the Chinese and be their friends. Just as in California in the 1850s onward, once things really went south in Edmonton and people were hurting, the Chinese were the first scapegoats to suffer. But Morris Cohn became a tireless advocate for the Chinese in Canada. And whenever he was in a position to help them out, that's what he did. These years, right after the Great War, weren't good at all for Morris Cohn. He couldn't stay out of trouble, and all the money he tried to make was of the dishonest kind. His reputation amongst the local law enforcement people was well known, and by the middle of 1922, things were getting too hot in Edmonton for Morris. He was being watched, and that put a major crimp in his thieving, gambling, and scamming ways. He was 35 years old. Up till now, he had wasted his existence, living a life of crime. To conform went against everything Morris Cohn believed in. Since arriving in Canada, he had done things his way, and he didn't care if it was legal or not, and he fleeced plenty of innocent people along the way. He didn't have any particular skills or aspirations that any normal person might have. So in short, he had nothing. He was broke. The economy in Canada was terrible. There were no jobs that he was qualified to do, and the Edmonton police had turned up the heat on Morris Cohn so badly, he had to leave. And so he went to China. Now, I'm sure he spoke a few words of Cantonese that he picked up along the way, but he was no China scholar, and he certainly didn't speak Chinese. The Chinese guys he knew in Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary, and Winnipeg, they all must have saw in this guy someone who sympathized with them and who probably had all these kinds of odd uses. So these society rejects, Morris Cohn and his various misfit Chinese brothers. They all bonded. He had learned China politics from Ma Sam and who was who inside the organization, and he had been invited to join the Tongmenghui that, in August 1912, was folded into a new party called the KMT, the Kuomintang. The thought of heading off to China had crossed Morris Cohen's mind more than once. He had again reached one of the several crossroads in his life. November 1922, no prospects, no nothing. An opportunity came, he took it. Morris Cohen sailed to China with someone surnamed Hong. Here's where Sun Yat-sen enters the picture. Sun Yat-sen had passed through Edmonton, but the two had never met. In his memoir, Morris made a big deal about serving his son's bodyguard whilst he was in Canada, but the reality was he was in prison when Sun passed through. But thanks to Cohen's association with the nationalist supporters in Canada, Sun knew who he was, and the two had corresponded by letter. So when Sun's people learned Morris Cohen was coming to China, and that he was coming to see them, in fact, they asked him to help out with something. And from this favor they asked him, an entire career was born. Morris Cohen was tasked with sourcing a railroad contractor in North America who could do a turnkey job building a line between Canton and Hankou. Morris Cohen did the necessary humping and name-dropping, and before you knew it, he actually lined up a firm to bid on this job. The contractor handed off their bid to Morris, and he packed it away for safekeeping. He took a train, again with this Mr. Hong, to Vancouver, and on November 23rd, 1922, he sailed west to China and arrived in Shanghai on December 12th. With this contract in hand and 8 guns packed in a suitcase, Cohen's hidden agenda was to leverage this railroad contract into something that amounted to a full-time line of work within Sun Yat-sen's organization. As soon as he alighted in Shanghai, Cohen made his way right to the Astor House Hotel in the International Settlement and began doing what he pretty much would do for the next 4 decades. He worked the lobby. This was his element. This was the arena where he knew he could shine and amount to something. The Astor House, by the way, was the first international-style modern hotel ever built in China. This structure went up in 1846 and was already a grand 76-year-old establishment when Moishe Cohen started hanging around the lobby. Back then, and still today, bars and lounges and hotel lobbies are common places to meet customers and business partners. Morris Cohen was not shy, let's just say that. He'd park himself somewhere in the bar, start a tab, and he'd chat up whoever he thought might be interesting in some way. He was always trying to get in on any deal he could and would name drop mercilessly to, show he was somebody. Morris Cohen never lost his Cockney accent, and he had that look of a rogue about him. Some were turned off by his style, but many were not. From his days hanging out with his Chinese mates back in Canada, he knew enough about what was happening in China to sound halfway intelligent. But from meeting Cohen, most any gentleman of quality knew right away that he was low-born, and whatever education he possessed, he learned it on the streets of somewhere. Morris Cohen didn't waste any time. Through a Russian Jewish emigre who worked at Sun Yat-sen's paper, the Shanghai Gazette, he got to meet the great man and the woman he would serve till the end of his days, Song Ching-ling, known also as Madame Sun Yat-sen. With railroad contract in hand, Cohen went to meet Sun and was just bowled over. He knew right away that he'd have no trouble dedicating his life to Sun and his cause. They discussed the details of the contract, and after finding all in order, Cohen let his people know it was a go, and they dispatched a couple reps to Shanghai to ink the deal. And just like the Lufthansa heist did for Henry Hill and Goodfellas, this railroad deal made Morris Cohen. He got to bask in quite a bit of shine, and he tried to parlay this deal and his closeness to Sun as a way to puff himself up in front of the other KMT people he came in contact with. How he did it, we'll never know, but for whatever reason, the Guofu himself, the father of modern China, gave the okay to allow Morris Cohen into his inner circle. And from that point on, and December 1922, Morris Cohen carried a business card that read, Morris A. Cohen, ADC to Sun Yat-sen. ADC meant aide de camp. And Cohen served as a bodyguard to Sun Yat-sen, but mostly you could describe him as a gopher at large. And of course, anything that required mixing with the Brits, Yanks, or other Westerners, Sun would often send Cohen to do the dirty work. February 15th, 1923, Sun took a trip to Hong Kong. By now, Sun was like a rock star and had the support of a wide swath of people, mostly in the south of China. He was treated like rock and roll royalty, and wherever Sun Yat-sen went, there was his Fuguan, Morris A. Cohen. A Fuguan was a bodyguard or aide de camp, and he did all the things you'd expect of a bodyguard. He cased joints, scanned crowds, and kept anyone suspicious as far away from his boss as possible. Cohen and his fellow bodyguards protected not only Sun Yat-sen, but Song Qing as well. He was already quite a character, but now Morris Cohen really went all out to reinvent himself. His uniform was always the same, a light-colored suit and tie and a sun helmet. He looked like a tough guy not to be messed with. He was already handy with a gun and taught his fellow bodyguards how to properly use one and how to fight. And the number of bodyguards slowly rose from a handful to more than 200. By March 23, 1923, Sun had been made head of the military government based in the South. And Sun's goal was to unite China and do away with all these warlords, mostly in the north and central part of China, but also in the south. If you're interested, I did a whole 10-part series on the history of the warlords from 1916 to 1928, and I invite you to go check that out. People called on Sun Yat-sen all day and night, and Cohen was constantly kept busy being in the middle of this. Not only Chinese called on Sun, Westerners as well. They too sought him out. Just in case he ended up on top, people knew they had to hedge their bets and keep a dialogue open with Sun's Kuomintang government. Travel writer Harry A. Frank wrote of those days, quote, Rarely during our months in Canton was the Generalissimo seen in public without Mrs. Sun II at his side and the belligerent, or at least highly protective face of Mr. Cohen in the immediate background. When we had the honor one Sunday morning to call upon Dr. Sun at his cement factory headquarters and residence, his Canadian shadow, tucked into a corner of the stairway at the entrance to the doctor's study, scrutinized not only me, but my wife, as if to make sure that we did not come to wreak mischief on his chief. End quote. 1920s and 1930s were rough times in China. A lot of things were happening, and still, since 1911, everything was still trying to get sorted out about who was going to be in charge now that the Qing Dynasty was gone. Sun's rival government in the south was a constant target of these warlords. So being a bodyguard for Sun Yat-sen was pretty serious work, and there were plenty of people who wanted to rub the revolutionary leader out. And Sun was well protected, but so were many political leaders that ended up getting assassinated. Moshe didn't have to wait long, and during one of these attempts to kill Sun Yat-sen, he and his fellow bodyguards exchanged gunfire with the would-be assassins. Morris ended up getting shot in his left arm. It was only a flesh wound, but he survived it okay. But like the time he stood up for Ma Sam back in Canada, this particular attempt became another seminal moment in Moshe's life. Morris Cohen said later about this incident, quote, The bullet that caught me in the left arm had made me think. Supposing it had been my right arm and I carried my gun on that side, I'd not have been able to use it. As soon as we got back to Canton, I got me a second gun, another Smith & Wesson revolver, and I packed it handy by my left hand. And I practiced drawing and soon found that I was pretty well ambidextrous. One gun came out as quick as the other. And with that, the legend was born, and he became known around town as Two-Gun Cohen, the guy who packed a .45 in his shoulder holster and another .45 on his hip. His salary was a few hundred Chinese dollars as Sun Yat-sen's aide de camp, and you could bet that as soon as his pockets were full, He blew everything on good food, good drink, and entertainment, and whatever was left over was gambled away. This was not just a job. Morris Two-Gun Cohen truly was dedicated to Sun Yat-sen, and he worshipped the man, and by extension, Song Qing as well. He admired how Sun wasn't the kind of leader who locked himself up in his compound and tried to govern from behind closed doors. Sun Yat-sen really was a man of the people and always did these walkabouts where he'd mingle with the masses and demonstrated genuine concern for their problems. There were times when people would approach Sun Yat-sen and mention some petty problem of theirs, and Sun knew right away it might sound petty, but the impact on the person was profound. And Sun would tell one of his aides to go take care of it, usually by offering the person whatever pitiful amount of money it took to resolve their problem. And he'd use money from his own pocket. Sun Yat-sen was the real deal, and Morris Cohen took his job seriously when it came to protecting him. Okay, if no one minds too much, I think we're going to just call it a night here. I'll pick up next time with the life of Morris Two-Gun Cohen in part 2. I hope you'll consider coming back for that. I assure you the story keeps getting better. So, until the next time, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the capital of the Southland, Los Angeles, California. Please think about coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.